Alright, so in this video, we're going to go over the different types of production. And we're going to start out with production externalities. In particular, we're going to start with what's called a negative production externality. So let's give an example. So let's say we've got a coal power station. So we need power produced. And let's say our power plant is coal. Through the production of that good, air pollution is created. And I think most of us can agree that air pollution is not a great thing. This air pollution is imposing a cost onto society. It makes our air tougher to breathe. It can cause some health problems. So with this extra cost that's being put onto society, our marginal social cost is therefore going to be bigger than the marginal private cost, the cost to just that one firm. Okay? So because of this, we're going to say that this is a negative externality. And because it's coming out as a result of producing, we're going to say that it's a production externality. So this is altogether, it's a negative production externality. Here's what this may look like. Okay? Now we've got a lot of familiar things that we may be used to seeing here. We've got this demand curve. Okay, in this particular case, if we can remember from last time, we said that the marginal private benefits, this is the same thing as the demand curve. And in our particular case, we don't have any sort of externality on demand, on consumption. It's the production that's where this is coming from. So in this particular case, the marginal social benefit and the marginal private benefit, they're going to be the same. Okay, so we just got this demand curve here. Now, where we might see some sort of a difference is that we have our marginal private costs. Okay, this is what we said was our supply curve. But now we see that we've got this marginal social cost curve that's different. Okay? In other words, let's say we've got this coal plant example. This marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost because of this extra cost that's being imposed onto society. Okay? So we've got these different things now where we've got our supply, which is the marginal private cost, but now we've got this overall cost to society. Okay? So, what other sorts of things can we learn from this? Well, prior to this, we should know that equilibrium, the market outcome, is where supply is equal to demand. Okay? So, let's find out where equilibrium is, where the supply equals demand. Well, supply, again, that's this marginal private cost. That's what we're calling that at this moment. And that's going to, where that equals marginal private benefit, our demand curve, that's going to be where our market outcome is. And that happens right here. Okay, so we follow this line down, and we see this Q star. That's going to be our market outcome for quantity. But we learned in the last lecture that if we're considering society as a whole, where marginal social costs and marginal social benefits, where they equal each other, which is here, that's going to be our socially efficient outcome. Okay, so we follow that all the way down here to our QE. So that E is just standing for efficient. So that's our new efficient outcome. And we see, well, quantity in the market outcome is greater than the quantity in the efficient outcome. And in other words, we're producing too much. And that should make sense, right? We're living in this world where we're not internalizing the costs that this pollution is having on society, so we're producing too much. We're not taking into account that cost. So that should make some sort of sense. So what other things can we learn? Well, how about welfare? Okay, society's welfare as a whole. So we know that uh, that we may have anytime we have some sort of changes in the market, if we're not at the efficient point, then we might have what's called deadweight loss. So let's see if we can figure out exactly where that is. I know it's fairly obvious where that is from looking at how I've got this image already. But how did I get that point? Well, I got that point through a particular method that I use to find the deadweight loss. And that method is that the area under a curve, that's really just the summation of the values of that curve. Okay, so for example, I use this red color to represent the area under the marginal social benefits curve. So if I'm just going to re-highlight over it. I've already highlighted it once, but if I just re-highlight this area is representing the total benefit to society. And I kind of this time when I did it, I kind of stopped here at this Q star, mainly because there's no production quantity we're interested in on the other side of that, so it doesn't really make sense to keep going. Now that being the case, we've got this total. So far we've got this total social benefit. Let's do the same thing and try to find the total social cost. So if I do that, I'm going to try to find this area under this social cost curve, this marginal social cost curve. And I'm going to just stop here at this Q star because there's nothing on the other side of that we would be interested in. Okay, so I've done that. So this area that I pointed out was going to be the deadweight loss earlier, this area here. So how can we tell this is the deadweight loss? Well, I've got this area of social cost that's not being offset by social benefit. Okay, so it turns out that if we produced here at this socially optimal amount, we wouldn't be picking up this negative surplus. Okay, so if we stopped producing here, then we wouldn't have to be picking up some extra negative surplus, and we don't have to, right? So in other words, stopping here prevents us from getting this extra social cost that isn't being compensated for by extra social benefit. Okay, so in other words, we're producing too much, and as a result of producing too much, we're getting this deadweight loss, this negative surplus in a way. Okay, and of course, as we've seen before when we've been wanting to calculate deadweight loss, this is a nice, pretty triangle, right? So we can use 1/2 base times height, and we can use that to calculate our deadweight loss, okay? But notice there's all these other things that look like triangles in our graph, right? There's a triangle there, there's a triangle here, maybe we'd think this is a triangle or this is a triangle, something like that. So there's all sorts of things that, look like they could be deadweight loss, right? So we've kind of got to know exactly where it is. And I think this is the best way to do that. However, there's only 4 different types of externalities. So if you prefer to just memorize them, I'm not going to blame you for that. Okay. So let's continue on with production externalities, and this time let's talk about a positive production externality. So the example we use for this is honey. Okay, so honey's produced by bees, and bees help pollinate nearby crops. Okay, so as a result, more fruit and vegetables can be harvested. So obviously farmers would like to see a lot of bees around. It's good for them, right? So maybe through the production of honey, if we produced more honey, we could get a better benefit for our crops. So because of this extra benefit, this benefit being added onto production, our marginal social cost is going to be less than the marginal private cost. Okay, so in other words, we've got a positive production externality. Okay, so let's see what that kind of looks like. Okay, so just like, oops, let me go back here. So just like we saw before, this demand curve has the marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit being the same. Okay, there's no externality on consumption. Okay, so that they're just going to be the same there. But now we see we've got our marginal private costs and we've got our marginal social costs below the marginal private costs. Okay, so in other words, this is our supply. This is our supply, and this is the social cost to society right here. Okay, all right. So we're just going to follow the same steps exactly that we followed on the last video. First of all, we might want to wonder where is the market outcome. Again, market outcome is where supply equals demand, or in other words, where marginal private costs equals marginal private benefit. Okay, and where does that happen? Well, we've got our marginal private costs here, and we've got our marginal private benefits is this curve. Okay, so they come together right here. Okay, so we just follow this down, and we see at the bottom here we've got Q star, some market outcome Q star. Okay, but what is our socially efficient quantity? Well, again, that's where socially optimal, that's where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. Okay, marginal social cost is right here, and our marginal social benefit, again, is the same demand curve. Okay, so that's going to come together right here. Okay, so we go down, and we see some QE, that is our efficient outcome socially. Okay, so in this case, the efficient outcome is greater than the market outcome. In other words, society's welfare would benefit from producing more. So we would say that because of that this is going to be a positive externality. And again, because this externality is on producers, we know it's on producers because we've got a supply curve that is where the marginal private cost is not equal to marginal social cost. So we would say this is a positive production externality. Okay. So exactly how we're going to find the deadweight loss for this is going to be the same way we saw us do it before. Okay. We're interested in, first of all, the total social benefit. If we wanted to do that, we would just find the area under this curve here, the marginal social benefits curve. Okay, and if we do that, it's taking a long time for this to undo. So we'll just wait for that for a little second. Let me use a different highlighter for this next one. So let's go ahead and just use this highlighter for that. There we go. Okay, so we've got this total social benefit underlined. So let's try to find this total social cost. Okay, this marginal social cost. That's going to be what's under the marginal social cost curve. Okay. And now I notice that we've got this area here. Oops. We've got this area here that has some potential surplus in it that is not being compensated by cost. So, in other words, we're producing at this quantity. This is our market outcome. But if we produced more, if we produced at the socially efficient outcome, we could gain some surplus. So this is some potential surplus that's sitting here. So deadweight loss doesn't necessarily have to be, some sort of negative surplus or something like that. It could be some potential surplus that we're missing out on, and that's the case here. We've got some social cost that is not being completely accounted for by social benefit. Okay, so we'd like to be able to capture this deadweight loss and add it to our overall surplus. And again, this deadweight loss is 1/2 base times height. Okay, so when we calculate that, that should be an easy enough calculation. We've done that a million times. Okay, but now let's talk about consumption externalities. In particular, let's start with negative consumption. So smoking these days in public isn't as bad of a problem as it used to be. But at one time, it was actually allowed in bars, airplanes, restaurants, all sorts of things like that. And if you were exposed to that smoke, even if you weren't the one smoking, so you're getting secondhand smoke, that actually can cause a lot of health problems. So the individual that's smoking isn't necessarily internalizing that cost that he's putting on someone else. Okay, and because of this extra cost to society, then the marginal private benefit is going to be greater than the marginal social benefit. Okay, and that's because socially there's been this extra cost that's been imposed. Okay, so this one I didn't go ahead and highlight these, so these will be a little bit easier to do that. So let's see what we've got here. So we've got one curve for production. So our marginal social cost is equal to our marginal private cost. Okay, so that's because we have no externality on production. But now we've got our marginal private benefits, which is, again, that's our demand. And here it's different than the marginal social benefit. Our marginal social benefit is going to be lower than the marginal private benefit because of this cost that's been levied on through this consumption. Okay, so same kind of thing here. We want to find a few things. We want to find the market outcome. Okay, so that's just where marginal private benefit equals marginal private costs. In other words, supply equals demand, equilibrium from prior chapters. And so that's going to happen here. Okay, so we go all the way down to our axis, and we see that this market allocation is going to happen here. Okay, but again, we're interested in the socially optimal amount. Okay, again, that's where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost, and that is going to happen here. Okay, so we just find that amount, we go down and find what quantity we're at, and this is the socially efficient allocation. Okay? All right, so we found those two amounts. But what else might we ask? Well, first of all, we know this is a negative consumption externality because I told you it is, but if I just gave you this graph, how could you know? Well, first of all, the free market allocation is greater than the socially efficient allocation. In other words, we would be efficient if we produced less. Okay, so that means we're producing too much. There's something bad about consuming this particular product. So we know that this is a negative externality. But is this production or consumption? Well, here for the supply curve, we see marginal social cost is the same as marginal private cost. There is no extra thing going on here for production. But when we look at the demand curve, we see this marginal private benefit, we say it's not the same as the marginal social benefit. Okay, so that's our clue that this is consumption. It's on the consumers. Okay, so what else can we learn from this? Well, again, we can try to figure out what the welfare loss is. What's our deadweight loss? Our social deadweight loss. And we're just going to do the same thing we did before. Okay, so we can say, well, what's our social benefit? Okay, and we're just going to highlight what's under the marginal social benefit curve. And let's pick a different color. Let's go with mint green this time. And we want to know, well, what is this social cost? Well, actually, that's an awful color. Let's change colors. Let's go with this blue. Okay, so we find out what's under this marginal social cost. Okay, and through this process, we see that there's an area where, because the fact that we're producing here this free market allocation and not here at the socially efficient allocation, there's an area where we've got this social cost that is not being compensated with social benefit. Okay? That's going to be our deadweight loss. If we produced here at the socially efficient allocation, we wouldn't have this negative surplus. But because we're producing here at this free market allocation, we do. Okay, so we're gonna want to produce here at the socially efficient allocation. Okay, so again, this is our deadweight loss, and as usual, 1/2 base times height is going to be how we would find the area of that triangle. Okay, and lastly, we have a positive consumption externality. Okay, so for an example for this, as we've got some neighbor plants flowers, and they're planting flowers because they like flowers, okay? But people that walk by can also enjoy how pretty that looks, right? They get some sort of benefit from that, okay? And so because of this extra benefit being added on, oops, how did that happen? That's what happens when you have a touchscreen. So because of this extra benefit, our marginal social benefit is going to be greater than our marginal private benefit. Okay, so we would say this is a positive consumption externality. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. So just like before, we've got kind of nothing going on here for the supply curve. The marginal private cost equals the marginal social cost. Okay. But as far as the demand curve, the marginal social benefit is going to be greater than the marginal private benefit. Okay? So what does this mean? Well, first of all, let's find the same things that we've been finding for the other cases. First, let's find the market quantity, or the free market allocation. So again, the market outcome is where demand is equal to supply. Can't write on this thing. Demand is equal to supply, or marginal private cost is equal to marginal private benefits. It's really the other way around. Okay? All right, so where does that happen? Well, this is our marginal private benefit right here, and this is our marginal private costs. So those two curves equal right here. Okay. And again, we want to find our socially optimal outcome, and that's where the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social costs. Okay, and so our marginal social costs right here, again, it's the same curve as marginal private costs in this case, and our marginal social benefit curve is right here. So they're going to come together here at point B. Okay, so we just follow this down to the x-axis and we see our socially efficient allocations right here. Okay, and again, we know this is a consumption externality because the demand curve is what has this externality on it. The marginal social benefit and marginal private benefit, they do not equal each other. And we know that this is a positive consumption externality because the socially efficient amount is greater than the free market amount. Okay, in other words, we want to produce more. If we produce more, we're going to have an increase in overall welfare. Okay, so last possible thing we can do with this is again find this deadweight loss. So why is it right there? So I'm just going to do the same thing that I've done with the other ones. I'm going to find the total social benefit, the total total social benefit, and the total social costs. So let's find the total social cost first. Okay, so that's just going to be the area under this is total social benefit. And now let's find the total social cost. Okay, so that's just going to be what's under this social cost curve. Okay. All right, so it turns out that there's an area right here where social benefit is not being outweighed by social cost. And the problem is that we're here, not here. We want to be at the socially efficient allocation so we can pick this area up. We can pick that welfare up. But we're not, we're here. Okay, so given that problem, we've got this potential surplus that we're missing out on. Okay, and again, this is a nice pretty triangle. Weight loss is 1/2 base times height. Right, so that's in general externalities and all the different types of externalities. So on the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how can we solve this problem of our free market allocation not being the same